Welcome back and thank you for staying with us right here on Morning at NTV. As people raid personal savings to put food on the table and meet their basic needs, access to financial products and services is key to helping people recover from financial shocks such as the COVID-19 pandemic and building their long-term resilience. However, there are fears that this economic resilience may not last if a lockdown is extended. Now, and to tell us more about this report, I have Rashmi Pillai, the Executive Director of financial sector Deepening Uganda, and she joins me right now via Skype. A very good morning, Ms. Rashmi. Yes, Ms. Rashmi, you have a report assessing the economic resilience of Ugandan households before COVID-19, part one of a series. Please tell us more about this report.
Sure. Thank you, Romeo, for having me on your show, and good morning to your viewers. As you mentioned, just before going into the report, I'm not sure how many of your viewers know about FSC Uganda. We are a premier institution that focuses on financial inclusion, a topic that is of extreme priority right now. Coming back to the report, this report is an analysis of what was the level of resilience of people before COVID. So it's a two-part series, as you rightly mentioned. Part one is what was the resilience before COVID, and part two is what is it today and how are they dealing with it. And part two is expected in 2 weeks. So to give you some highlights of the resilience levels, we discovered that 3 out of 4 Ugandans were already struggling to pay their bills on time. More than 50% of adults said that if they found themselves in an emergency situation, they would not be able to raise funds very quickly. In fact, this number is higher for adult women, at 60% of them saying we would not be able to raise funds immediately. Most people, in case of an emergency, rely on their friends and family and extended network for gaining some kind of remittances and support. But when everybody faces a pandemic like this, a systematic shock like this, or that level of remittance support is completely fraught, and it is completely impossible because everybody's suffering from the same situation. What makes this even more challenging, as we have seen in the data, is most people, especially micro and small businesses, work with SACCOs. They save and lend with SACCOs. And at this point in time, as you mentioned, liquidity levels are very low. People are not making money. The health crisis has resulted in an economic crisis. And because they're not making any money, they're drawing down on their savings, but expenditure has not reduced proportionately. And going forward, they will need actually more loans or support to bounce back into earning incomes, especially at a time where financial institutions are also facing liquidity pressure. So it's creating a big tension in the process of recovery.
Miss, Go
Sorry,
ahead.
go ahead, Romeo.
Go ahead.
Okay. But the report also, this is also an opportunity for us to think through how do we rebuild a more resilient society back. As the cliche goes, we should not let any crisis go to waste. This is an opportunity. When we did the analysis, we realized that there are opportunities here for us to build a more inclusive society. One of the opportunities that has emerged is the role of digital in connecting supply and demand. While, of course, at the moment, it has been largely concentrated in urban areas, but there's an opportunity to digitize SACCOs, so that SACCO members, in case of a worst case scenario like this, like reinfection rates, etc., can connect and serve their members. There's an opportunity for vendors and supply chain to be connected digitally. So as we think of recovery of businesses and people, we should think of how we are rebuilding in a way that makes them more stronger and resilient.
Ms. Rashmi, digitizing SACCOs would be a very good idea, but then we are talking about a country that has low internet penetration. How is that possible in a country like Uganda with few people having access to the internet?
That's a great question, Romeo. So it would not be a challenge if it were easy, wouldn't it? So the short answer is we have to invest so a couple of ideas, right? So there are already a lot of organizations trying to digitize SACCOs. So it's not a new idea. Several of them have done it. We'll have to figure out a way of making this infrastructure cheaper. For example, instead of every single institution trying to build its own proprietary platform, why can't we figure out a way of shared infrastructure so that the cost of building that is shared among multiple institutions and it is not passed on to customers? Second, the second question is, how do we ensure and increase ownership of phones or internet among people? That's actually a really big challenge because phone and internet individual ownership is actually still low. This is where policy measures can come in place along with the private sector. How do we get affordable phones that probably have some kind of tax holiday on them so that it would reduce the costs and increase the individual phone and internet penetration in the hands of people? And then the third part that comes in is the incentives. Do people have the incentives to use digital once a pandemic like that gets over? The answer would be yes. It depends on how we design these solutions. And if we design this in a way that gives value to people, they will continue to use it.
Rashmi, what's entailed in this report that might be of help to vulnerable families and businesses to stay resilient and recover after COVID-19?
Sorry, Romeo, you'll have to repeat that question.
Yes, what's entailed in your report that might be of help to these vulnerable families and households and also the businesses? How can they stay resilient and recover after COVID-19?
Absolutely. So I would look at it as businesses and people, as you rightly mentioned. The first thing that we have to think is from a policy level. So the central bank, the Uganda Microfinance Regulatory Authority, and the government of Uganda have done a lot of work in making sure that there's liquidity in the financial system. One of the things that we would like to push for, and this is already something that UMRA and the BOU are thinking about, is how do we further extend the support that we're getting from the World Bank, IMF, etc., to the informal sector, most of whom are not in formal financial services, most of whom are in tier 4 and below, which is non-deposit taking microfinance institutions, SACCOs, cooperatives, etc. So what is the process for meeting where the greatest need is? Because the greatest supply and the greatest need, there's a big bridge. And what is the kind of bridge that helps us get to where people are? Because most people are working in, in small businesses, maybe 1 to 5 people, and they don't have the runway of more than 3 to 4 months of cash flow. In fact, 3 months is also a stretch. So they will not survive unless there is some kind of mechanism that this liquidity support is trickling down. Now, that can be through partnerships between banks and some of the large SACCOs, cooperatives, and MFIs, but that relationship needs to be more structured so that it reaches there. The second thing is we have in our report mentioned 2 items. One is around G2P, government to person transfers, especially for the most vulnerable, the SAGE program. Because of the COVID, the Ministry of Gender is trying to make sure that they're able to honor commitments around the SAGE program. And this is also where digitization comes in, because these are people who are 80 and above, and they have been left worse off because they were not prepared for this kind of a shock. Lastly, there is also, we mentioned unconditional cash transfers to families who are absolutely below the poverty line. They just need an injection of a stimulus to help them get back on their feet. And this could be even, especially households with infants below 2 years of age, because there's also a nutrition-based risk that these infants face during this time. So these are a couple of the ideas around people and businesses. One of the other things that we feel that we should actively as a country think about is when we talk about tax breaks, when we talk about fiscal policy and support to the private sector, how can we do it in a manner that safeguards jobs? How do we incentivize people to say, all right, if you want a tax break, maybe what is the proposal to have 80% or 60% of, and actually 80% and more of your staff retained, so that people are not furloughed or people are brought back into employment?
Rashmi, you've told us what you're doing in your report, and you also hinted what government should be doing to arrest the situation. But then what about the community? What is the role of the community in all of this? How do we as a community respond to ensure that vulnerable households and businesses thrive during COVID-19 and after?
Sure. So first and foremost, again, as we mentioned, there are a lot of community-based organizations, community-based settings and structures, both formal, informal. And this is a time where we have seen, because both the communities have come together to support each other around a health crisis. And I'm very certain that we will see communities coming together creatively to support people on economic bounce back. Again, this is also we have seen in the past that when it comes to businesses, people lend to each other. People lend to each other where not just money lenders as a formal or informal mechanism, but people also support each other in the forms of remittances or extending supplier credit, because you can have a wholesaler supplier relationship. So there are ways, informal, non-formal ways of actually connecting people. Um, and we will see a lot of those creative solutions coming together.
In your report, you also highlight evidence that the fragility of the financial lives of adult men and women. And you also talk about the structural divides that will be deepened as a result of COVID-19.
Yes.
What does this statement mean?
That's such a great question, Romeo. So what you will notice in the report is one is that COVID-19 or this pandemic is not gender agnostic. It is leaving women worse off. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. One is we've discovered that women have 6 times less liquid savings, meaning cash or cash equivalents, compared to men. They typically save, like most people, in goats and other types of livestock or with savings group. But in a pandemic like this, it's very hard to sell illiquid or semi-liquid assets. And even if you do, it would be a distressed sale because nobody has money. You're selling it at lower than what you would get in a normal situation. So one, there was already a gender issue, and now a pandemic has worsened and made this more entrenched. Second is the digital divide. Well, we already discussed that individual phone ownership is 46% for women and about 58% for adult men. But if you talk about individual consistent internet ownership, that is significantly low in the country. So when we think about building digital solutions, the people who will first get connected, who would be able to rise above this pandemic, would be the ones who were already the people who had it. People who had phones, people who had internet connections, they'll be able to bounce back faster than the have-nots. And that is where we feel that it will entrench the divide that exists in society if we don't work together to figure out inclusive solutions.
Ms. Rashmi, your report also recommends that those people in power should keep the vulnerable people at the center of what they are doing. But then you've also seen the resistance to cash injections by the government. What exactly do you want these decision makers to do?
So sorry, Romeo, that's actually a very complex but very important question. So keeping people at the center is not to say, okay, let's have cash injections and that's about it. Keeping people at the center means how do we help them bounce back right now, but also how do we help them bounce back in a manner that is long-term, that gives them independence and to help them get back on their feet. If somebody today is under the poverty trap, they just need help to get back out of poverty before they're able to save, before they're able to invest. So they're not able to, if you're struggling to put food on the table, you're not going to educate children, you're not going to do other things that help you move up the economic ladder. So it is the discussion that should we not, cash injections, it's important, but it's also a short-term measure. So cash injections is one step in a multi-stage process. And that's what we mean by keeping people at the center. We mean that, yes, help them get out of the situation they are in. Then, for example, if they're micro enterprise, how can we use the existing infrastructure like incubators that exist in the country, or even banks or other financial intermediaries to say, okay, how can we help you restructure your small business so that it becomes more resilient in the future? What can we then do to give you financial access? What can we do to give you credit at concessionary rates? What can we do to help you get medical insurance? Because medical insurance is very low in this country, so that your out-of-pocket expenditure is not very high. So as we design and think of people's resilience, we have to think holistically and not just in terms of just cash injections or only credit. There's both inflows of money and outflows of money. And how do we help people increase their, people and businesses increase their take-home income? That should be our focus.
Okay, Ms. Rashmi, you also hinted about how government can help people in the long time. I'll borrow a leaf from what other governments are doing, especially the United States. You have strongmen, politicians like Bernie Sanders, you have Kamala Harris, you have Joe Biden coming out to call for universal basic income for those struggling families, and also talk about stimulus packages, something that has already been done by the Trump administration. So I'm going to take you to another conversation, which is the economic, social, and political policies that can be employed by our African governments, especially Uganda, to support the vulnerable people in this country.
Okay.
What are some of those socio-economic and political policies that we could employ to help vulnerable families?
Romeo, this is actually, I don't mean, sorry, this is again very complex, because when we can take some ideas and principles from what Western governments have done, but we'll also have to contextualize it to what we can do. For example, some of these large governments have the capacity to give, in fact, they have, the US, for example, could have given about $2,000 to $3,000 per household. Canada has done that. They have 80%, of households have received cash injections. They have that capability to do that. So we have to take it in the context of, do we have that capability? Do emerging economies have that capability to do that, and at what cost?
Indeed.
So it may have to be a little bit more targeted, because if we don't have that kind of surplus that we are sitting on, then we need to figure out how do we channel that very small resource envelope that we have to have the biggest bang for our buck, to have the biggest return for value of investment made. And that's where we are saying, let's target people the most in need. Let's have a multitude of instruments in our toolkit. For those who absolutely are vulnerable, let's give them some kind of a stimulus that helps them get back. For those who need technical assistance or some kind of support, but they'll be able to pay back a loan, or will need some kind of incubation support so that their business can grow, and they know how to structure it in a manner so that other types of instruments can come in, or other types of banks or cooperatives can give them money and help them grow. Then let's use different types of instruments in our toolkit. It may not be wise for us to say, oh, that's what other nations are doing. Sure, but they have that capability. We'll have to find African solutions for African problems.
Indeed, African solutions for African problems. I like that, Ms. Rashmi. And in the report authored by your organization, you are asking the government to actually support Fintechs. In this time of COVID-19, one would think that Fintechs are well placed to handle the pandemic. Would you agree?
Yes and no. We have a very young, emerging, very proud and indigenous fintech sector in Uganda. And a lot of these young startups, as I mentioned, have 3 to 4 months of runway. A lot of them are also giving uncollateralized credit to small vendors, to small businesses. Many of them are in the payments business. Some of them are in insurance. They need our support. When we were talking about, Romeo, financial intermediaries earlier, and we were talking about where a lot of the surplus support is going, sorry, not surplus, but support is going from the World Bank, IMF, etc. The report mentions that we feel that fintechs are critical. Digitization doesn't happen without these intermediaries, and they need to exist, because if you end up with one or two, then you end up with a monopoly or oligopolistic market, which means that it is not a competitive market. People don't have choice, and a competitive market, a financial market, is a more resilient financial market. And that's why we felt that there needs to be a discussion around how are we supporting the fintech industry in this country.
And of course, examples abound of fintechs that are doing really, really well and have seen an increase in transactions for people who are, dealing in that space. Now, Ms. Rashmi, do they need support to manage this overnight success?
Sure. again, there are some, there are multiple revenue streams, Romeo. It's not very black and white. So we hear a lot about more fintechs, but most of them, there has been some rise in digital transactions, and depending, because a lot of that is happening via mobile money. Some fintechs will need support, and they are increasing capacity, which is good for them. They are pivoting, they are taking advantage of the situation, as they rightly should, and are trying to grow their business. But a lot of the other companies are struggling because they were trying to raise capital, which is suddenly dried up in this situation. Most investors are taking a wait and watch approach. And in fact, they're waiting for the COVID crisis to blow over and see how they can pick up shares in companies for bargain prices. Then there's the other situation of if this aggregate demand has gone down, and therefore you're not making as much money as you would, which means you have the operational challenge of paying people salaries. A lot of companies have made salary cuts, if not furloughed employees. And then there is the last challenge: if you're so cash strapped, how do you invest in new ideas? How do you pivot if you're so cash strapped? So it's a complex situation. And even if again, this is not to say that fintechs are not resilient in this country and they will not find solutions. They will. But a small facility, using this kind of support that we're getting internationally, to say, how do we also support that? How do we earmark funds to even give them concessional support? And I'm sure a lot of the fintechs would appreciate this. It would help them it would help us preserve a more competitive financial structure.
Indeed, Ms. Rashmi, let's now talk about the effects of COVID-19. I'll talk about the United States, which is actually reeling from the effects of COVID-19. 20.5 million Americans have lost their jobs. Now, if you're going to add on the number of Americans who have actually reduced the number of hours they're giving their employers, that is 40.5 million Americans out of work, of having their working hours reduced, or are working remotely from home. Now, in the case of Uganda, and basing on your report, what are the numbers? What are your projections? What is the casualty list looking like?
So our report estimates that we will see at least 3 million people going back into poverty. We estimate that about 23% of adults in the country are at survival risk. Of course, some may get support from family, because some adults live with larger families, etc. So if you're in a reasonably okay household, then maybe the burden is not that high. But a significant, at least 23% adults will be at risk. And we are seeing many companies furlough or lay.
Go ahead, Ms. Rashmi.
And that's why in our recommendation, we mentioned that we need to look at how are we incentivizing these companies to bring back people into the workforce. So yes, we are going to see a lot of challenges with formal employment, especially employers who have had to figure out ways of cutting costs. And they will have to be also a little. And what we've also observed, Romeo, just not to always look at the negative side of things, is people have the opportunity to be creative. People in the past have shown, when they face economic shocks like this, they have figured out innovative ways of not only survival, but also to thrive. And we need to make sure, as policymakers and development actors, that we give them the opportunity to do that.
Of course, you did say that we need to find African solutions to these African problems, and you were skeptical to buy the idea of universal basic income because of the differences between the United States and Uganda in that regard. But then there's another solution. Let's talk about solutions-based journalism a bit, Ms. Rashmi. Do you think it's feasible for the NSSF to start giving back some money to the workers in this period, for them to catch up with the effects of this COVID-19 pandemic? Do you think it's a feasible idea for the NSSF to do such a thing?
Okay. So I would say that we should not look at it only from the angle of NSSF, Romeo, because I believe that what you're asking is people are saving as a function of certain types of structures, right? So social security.
Yeah.
The way NSSF is arranged at the moment and the way the law and the structure is, you get it at, retirement. In other countries, what happens is you have intermediate type of structures, you have provident funds, etc. What that allows you is that you have a longer term wealth creation structure like the NSSF, but you have shorter term ways of saving money that you can draw down on when you are facing some kind of situation like this, or even if you want to use it as a collateral, say you want to buy a house or build asset, then you can use it. So the point, I believe, the intention that you're trying to say is how can we use these structures to help people better manage the risks that they are facing? By just relegating the conversation to just NSSF and the current existing structure, it might be a missed opportunity for us, because we can say, sure, maybe the NSSF tomorrow can allow for a small drawdown in extraordinary circumstances like this. But are there other structures that of wealth creation for intermediate steps if people want to protect themselves against shock, but also use those funds for other kinds of asset building opportunities? And I feel that's where we need to, that's the kind of structure and models where we can borrow from other countries and say, what do other countries have and what can work for Uganda?
Ms. Rashmi, what are your final recommendations that could be employed by that person who is reeling right now? No job, no work whatsoever, no food. So they're looking at after the lockdown, how do I go about with life? What are some of the recommendations you may have for these people and other businessmen that are reeling all the same?
Sure. For businesses, I would say, most businesses are parts of various types of WhatsApp communities or SACCOs, etc. Reach out to businesses who are in the same value chain or doing the same. If you're in agriculture or poultry, doing the same type of business, and try to find ideas of how you can bounce back very quickly. Number two, if you have loans or debt, renegotiate with your lenders, because the BOU, UMRA have given that opportunity. Please take advantage of it, because that will give you the much needed cash flow that you need. The NSSF for formal businesses has given an amnesty as well, very important for cash flow reasons, so that you can help that and put that back into the business till you're able to pay back that money. For individuals, my recommendation would be reach out to your networks, see how you can continue providing value. It would be a good time to also think through what is it that you want to do next, and see how digital solutions can help you at low cost. And so, a brick and mortar shop might be very expensive. Are there other ways at low cost reaching to to your customers that allows you to increase your income at a very low cost in the future?
Wise words from the Executive Director of Financial Sector Deepening Uganda, that is Ms. Rashmi Pillai. Thank you very much for having made the time to speak to us right here on NTV. Well, you're still watching Morning at NTV. My name is Romeo Busiku. I hope you've borrowed a leaf or two in that regard to actually manage your finances and also get a few tricks on how to survive post-COVID-19. Let's take another short break. We'll be right back with more information. You're watching Morning at NTV.